Landing an army on a defended enemy coast is one of the hardest things a military can attempt to do. The Allies had already tried it once, in 1942, and that attempt collapsed within 6 hours with catastrophic losses. However, 2 years later, they were about to try it again, this time in the largest military operation in human history. Almost everything that decided how that morning went had been settled months or years earlier by men who never saw the beaches. And a lot of it is actually not the way it has been told for decades, which is what we're going to show you today. The Soviet Union had been fighting Germany since June 1941 and was carrying almost the entire weight of the land war. Stalin wanted a second front opened in the West as soon as possible, ideally in the summer of 1942, to force Germany to divide its army. Several senior American commanders agreed with him. Churchill did not. He'd seen what a direct assault on a defended coast was likely to cost, and he wanted the Germans weakened first. Roosevelt was undecided for a long time. He doubted the United States was ready for an operation on that scale, and he was also thinking past the war, hoping to keep the Soviet Union as a partner afterward. Stalin was told the invasion would have to wait until 1943. Instead, the Western Allies went at Germany indirectly. In North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces under Montgomery halted Rommel at El Alamein in late 1942, and in November of that year, American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. The two forces squeezed the Germans and Italians between them until the Axis position in Tunisia collapsed in May 1943. From there, the Allies crossed to Sicily on July 10, 1943, and to the Italian mainland in September, a route Churchill had described as the soft underbelly of Europe. It was not. The Italians overthrew Mussolini and changed sides, which sped things up briefly, but German troops moved in and held the mountains, and the Allied advance ground to a halt short of Naples. The route through Italy was never going to reach Germany quickly. By late 1943, the argument was over. At the Tehran Conference, which opened on December 1, 1943, Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed that the main effort would be a landing in northern France in 1944. Two questions followed immediately. Who would command it and where exactly would it go? But before we answer those, there are two operations you need to know about, because they shaped how the whole invasion was planned, and both of them went badly. The first was the raid on Dieppe on August 19, 1942, codenamed Operation Jubilee. About 6,100 troops took part, roughly 5,000 of them Canadian, with around 1,000 British commandos and 50 American Rangers. The plan was to seize the port, destroy the German defenses, gather intelligence on how the coast was held, and withdraw the same day. Within 6 hours, the survivors were retreating. Tanks bogged down in the pebbles and couldn't get off the beach. Troops who landed were pinned where they stood. Of the 4,963 Canadians who set out, only 2,210 came back, and many of those had never managed to land. In total, 907 Canadians were killed, and 1,946 were taken prisoner. More prisoners than the Canadian Army would lose in 11 months of fighting after D-Day. All 27 tanks were gone. The Royal Air Force lost 106 aircraft, its worst single day of the war. Two conclusions came out of Dieppe. The first was tactical and specific. A defended port couldn't be taken by direct assault from the sea. Ports were where the Germans concentrated their guns, and an invasion that needed a harbour on the first day would be attacking the strongest point on the coast. The second was broader. An invasion could not be improvised. It needed overwhelming fire support, specialized equipment to get men and vehicles off the sand, and far more preparation than anyone had allowed for in 1942. The second operation was Exercise Tiger, a full-scale rehearsal held at Slapton Sands on the Devon coast in April 1944. The beach was chosen because it resembled Utah, one of the beaches the Americans would be landing on, and it was dressed with obstacles to imitate the Atlantic Wall. 23,000 American troops took part, with live naval gunfire so the men would get used to shells passing over them. On April 27th, a miscommunication sent landing craft in while the ships were still shelling the beach, and Americans were killed by their own supporting fire. That night was worse. A convoy of landing ships was crossing Lime Bay when German E-boats, fast torpedo boats, found it. British warships had detected the E-boats and were moving to intercept, but they couldn't warn the American ships because the two forces hadn't been given each other's radio frequencies. Yes, really. The attack came at about 1:30 in the morning on April 28th. Two landing ships were sunk and a third badly damaged, and 749 Americans died. A large number of them drowned rather than being killed outright because they'd been issued life belts but never taught how to wear them, and many put them on around the waist rather than under the arms, which tipped them face down in the water. Tiger nearly stopped the invasion by itself. Several of the officers listed missing afterward had been briefed on the Normandy plan. Until their bodies were recovered and accounted for, nobody could be certain the Germans hadn't pulled a man out of the water who knew where the landings were going. When the count came back complete, the operation went ahead. So, back to those two questions from earlier. The location was actually settled before anyone knew who would command the operation. The Pas de Calais was the natural choice. It offered the shortest crossing, which meant the invasion fleet spent less time exposed at sea, and it allowed maximum fighter cover from airfields in southeast England. It was also the most direct road to Germany. The problem was that all of this was as obvious to the Germans as it was to the Allies. The German 15th Army under von Salmuth held Calais with the best troops and the strongest fortifications on the coast. Landing there meant attacking the enemy where he was strongest and where he was expecting the blow. The alternative came from Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan. In the spring of 1943, the combined Chiefs of Staff appointed him Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, a post abbreviated to COSSAC, at a time when no Supreme Commander had been chosen. Morgan was effectively building a headquarters for a general who did not yet exist. At the Washington Conference in May 1943, the Allies settled on the codename Overlord and a target date of May 1st, 1944, and Morgan's staff worked through the options against the forces likely to be available. By the end of July, they had a plan. It concluded that the best chance of success lay in an assault across the beaches of Normandy. Normandy was farther from England, which made the crossing longer and the air cover thinner, but it was far less heavily defended. The outline plan was approved by Churchill and the British chiefs, and then presented to the Americans at the Quebec Conference in August 1943, where Roosevelt and the American chiefs signed off on it. What Morgan proposed was smaller than what happened. His plan was for 3 divisions landing on 3 beaches in the Caen sector, between Ouistreham and roughly the line of Vieilleville. Everything beyond that came later. Only then did the Allies choose a commander for it. Montgomery was the obvious British candidate. He'd beaten Rommel in the desert, he was known to the public, and he had recent experience of large amphibious operations in Sicily and Italy. But by 1944, the majority of the troops involved would be American, and it was accepted that an American should have overall command. At the end of December 1943, the job went to Dwight Eisenhower. The choice was not obvious. Eisenhower had spent the whole of the First World War in the United States and had never commanded troops in battle. Montgomery had, and so had Patton. What Eisenhower had instead was the ability to make a coalition function. The invasion involved American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces, along with men from a dozen occupied countries, and it needed commanders who disliked each other to work to the same plan. Eisenhower was better at that than anyone else available, and it's the main reason D-Day was one operation rather than 3 run in parallel. He arrived in London on January 15, 1944, to take over a plan that had been in preparation for 9 months. Because the Supreme Commander was American, his ground forces commander had to be British, and that post went to Montgomery. Their first act was to change what they'd been given. Montgomery argued that 3 divisions on a narrow front would leave the invasion force packed into a small perimeter along the beaches with no room to build up, and that the Germans would be able to seal it off. The assault was expanded from 3 divisions to 5. He pushed the eastern flank out to Caen, which opened onto flat country where armored divisions could deploy and temporary airfields could be built, and he extended the western flank into the Cotentin, and that's where Utah Beach came in. Utah was a late addition, and it existed for one reason: to get the Allies closer to Cherbourg. Cherbourg mattered because it was a deep water port, and sooner or later an army of that size would need one. Widening the front also pushed the date back, because the larger assault needed more landing craft than were available on May 1st. Shortly after arriving, Eisenhower presented his command team to the press. They were photographed standing over a map, which is one of the more telling photos of the whole preparation, because the map was faded and illegible, and had been chosen for exactly that reason. The plan itself was among the most closely held secrets of the war. What the cameras were given was a picture of men planning, with nothing in it that could be read. Now let's cross the channel and see what the Germans were doing all this time. Germany's problem after 1940 was the length of the coast it had won. From northern Norway to the Spanish border, every western-facing shore was a possible landing site, and Hitler couldn't garrison all of it while fighting in the east and in Italy. His answer was fortification. War Directive 40, issued on March 23, 1942, ordered the coasts of the occupied territories built up as a matter of urgency. The result was called the Atlantic Wall, and it was constructed between the spring of 1942 and the spring of 1944. The scale is usually overstated, including by Hitler, who called himself the greatest fortress builder of all time and never once visited the Channel defenses. The wall ran for roughly 1,700 miles, and a figure of about 2,500 miles is sometimes given if every stretch of the Norwegian coast is counted. It was never continuous. The plan called for around 15,000 concrete strongpoints, and the effort consumed something over 22 million cubic yards of concrete and more than 1 million tons of steel. What was actually built was heavy in some places, thin in others, and unfinished in many. It was built by Organisation Todt, the construction arm of the Nazi state, run by Fritz Todt, and after his death in 1942 by Albert Speer. Across its western projects, Todt employed close to 1.5 million people, and somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 worked on the wall in France. Only about 1 in 10 was German. Until late 1942, many were French civilians who took the work voluntarily because the wages were high. After that, the labor was increasingly forced. Around 80,000 Frenchmen conscripted under the compulsory labor service. About 40,000 Spanish Republicans who had fled to France after their own civil war and were deported to the coast by the Vichy government in cattle cars, and Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, North Africans, Indochinese and Belgian Jews. Conditions varied by nationality and were worst for the Soviet and Spanish workers, and many of them didn't survive it. Rommel was made a field marshal in 1942 and sent to inspect the wall at the end of 1943. He was in France by early 1944, commanding Army Group B, with his headquarters at the Château de la Roche-Guyon on the Seine. He was still respected by his enemies after North Africa, though less so by parts of the German High Command, where he was variously seen as a man who had lost a campaign, a rival for Hitler's attention, or simply someone they disliked. He found the wall in poor condition and the work being done without urgency, and his arrival meant everyone under him suddenly had a lot more work to do. He ordered a very large mining program along the coast and in the water in front of it, along with obstacles designed to rip open landing craft, barriers built from old railroad track, and the deliberate flooding of low ground inland to drown paratroopers and prevent gliders from landing. But underneath all of this, there was a disagreement about how the invasion should be fought, and it was never resolved. Rommel's position came from North Africa, where he'd watched Allied air power destroy his ability to move. He believed that once the Allies were ashore, any German counterattack coming from inland would be broken up from the air long before it arrived. The only chance, he argued, was to have the armor close enough to the beaches to hit the invasion while it was still in the water and before a beachhead existed. Von Rundstedt, commander-in-chief in the west, took the opposite view. Spreading the armor along the coast would tie it to positions that might be nowhere near the actual landing. Better to hold it concentrated inland and send it where it was needed once the Allies had committed themselves. Hitler split the difference, which produced the worst of both arrangements. 3 armoured divisions, including the 21st Panzer near Caen, went to Rommel's Army Group B. The rest, including the 12th SS Panzer and Panzerlehr, were held back in Panzer Group West under Guy von Schweppenberg, and that reserve reported directly to Hitler and couldn't be committed without his personal authorization. The result was that there wasn't enough armor forward to do what Rommel wanted, not enough held back to do what von Rundstedt wanted, and a command arrangement that guaranteed delay at the one moment when delay would matter most. Rommel understood what was at stake. Inspecting the defenses in April 1944, he told his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, that the war would be won or lost on the beaches, that the enemy could only be stopped while he was still in the water, and that the first 24 hours would be decisive for both sides. He wrote the same thing in a letter to his wife. It would be, he said, the longest day. Meanwhile, on the other side of the channel, the Allies were doing their homework. They knew more about the Normandy coast than any invading force had ever known about a shoreline, and the effort to find it out began long before the location was chosen. Photographic reconnaissance was the largest part of it. Aircraft, including the Spitfire, the P-38 Lightning, and the P-51 Mustang, flew low-level runs along the coast, photographing obstacles, gun positions, and beach gradients. Many of these aircraft carried no guns at all, with the weight given over to fuel and speed instead, on the principle that a reconnaissance pilot's protection was not being caught. Flying that low made power lines and trees as dangerous as the German gunners. More than 3,200 sorties were flown in direct support of Overlord. And here's the clever part. Normandy was photographed no more heavily than anywhere else along the coast, precisely so the pattern of flights wouldn't tell German intelligence where the interest lay. The French resistance supplied what aircraft could not. Resistance networks mapped fortifications, tracked which units were where, and reported changes, all under conditions where discovery meant deportation or execution. Small boat parties went in at night to take soundings of the approaches and to collect samples of the sand itself. This mattered more than it sounds. Parts of the Normandy beaches were underlaid by ancient forest that had turned to peat before being submerged, and a beach that looked firm could swallow a tank. Everything collected was fed into the assault plan. The strangest source was the British public. In 1942, the BBC broadcast an appeal asking listeners to send in vacation photos and picture postcards of the European coast. The broadcast told them that a snapshot that looked like nothing more than somebody's mother in sunglasses on a beach might, properly used, be worth more than 10 torpedoes or 20 tanks. The request deliberately covered the whole coast from Norway to the Pyrenees rather than just France or Normandy, partly because asking for one stretch would have pointed straight at the plan, and partly because in 1942 the landing site hadn't been chosen. The planners expected perhaps 10,000 items. 30,000 arrived in the first batch of mail. By 1944, somewhere around 10 million photographs, postcards, guidebooks, hotel brochures, and maps had been sent in, and Morgan's staff went through them, looking for the height of sea walls, the slope of beaches, and the firmness of the sand. Photographs that turned out to be useful were eventually printed into the briefing material issued to the assault troops. Behind all of it sat Ultra, the intelligence produced by breaking German ciphers at Bletchley Park. By 1944, roughly 18,000 encrypted German messages a day were being read. Ultra gave the Allies a broadly complete picture of the German order of battle in the West, and, most valuably, the locations of the armored divisions. It also let them do something no attacker had been able to do before, which was to check whether their own deception was working, because the weekly German assessments of Allied intentions could be read directly. Now, two things need to be said here, and both are usually left out. The first is that Ultra was less decisive in France than it had been in North Africa, because German forces in France could use secure telephone and telegraph lines for much of their traffic instead of radio. The second is more serious. Ultra revealed that on May 29th, the German 91st Air Landing Division, which specialized in fighting paratroopers, along with the 6th Parachute Regiment, had moved into precisely the area where the American airborne divisions were to drop. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory was alarmed enough to recommend that the airborne operation be cancelled outright. Eisenhower overruled him, and the German 352nd Division, a full-strength field formation, moved up from St. Lo to the bluffs above what would become Omaha Beach, and the Allies never confirmed the move. Aerial photographs on June 3rd suggested an unidentified unit had arrived, but the picture was never resolved. The men who landed at Omaha met a division the intelligence system had not located. But knowing the coast was only half of the game, the other half was making sure the Germans looked the wrong way. The whole plan depended on the Germans not reinforcing Normandy quickly. If the divisions held at Calais moved south in the first days, the invasion could be pushed back into the sea before it had built up. The deception designed to prevent this was called Operation Bodyguard, and it was the most successful operation of its kind ever run. Bodyguard worked in several directions at once. Fortitude North threatened an invasion of Norway. Other strands pointed at southern France, the Balkans, and even neutral Sweden. But the main effort was Fortitude South, which was designed to convince the German High Command that the real blow would fall at the Pas de Calais, and that anything happening in Normandy was a feint. Its centerpiece was an army that did not exist. The 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, was invented on paper. 11 divisions and around 150,000 men, supposedly assembling in Kent and Essex, directly across the Channel from Calais. It was given a commander the Germans would find entirely convincing. George Patton was rated by German intelligence as the best Allied field commander, so naturally he'd be given the main assault rather than a diversion. So Patton was placed in southeast England with nothing to do but be seen. He toured, made speeches, and was photographed. The physical side of the deception was built to be seen from the air and no closer. Dummy tanks and vehicles were positioned in fields, with real vehicles driven around them first so the ground showed tracks. Dummy landing craft were assembled from scaffolding pipes, lumber, canvas, and empty oil drums, and 255 of them were moored at Folkestone alone. From high altitude, none of it could be distinguished from the real equipment gathering in the west. At the same time, signals units transmitted the volume and pattern of radio traffic that an army group of that size would generate. And German agents in Britain, all of whom had been captured and turned, fed back a steady, carefully coordinated stream of confirmation. For every 2 targets attacked in and around Normandy, 2 more were hit elsewhere along the coast, chosen for their effect on the German picture rather than their effect on the invasion. It worked. On June 6th, German intelligence still believed that around 10 divisions were waiting in England to attack Calais, at a point when the force in Normandy was already counted in the hundreds of thousands. More importantly, Fortitude did not stop on D-Day. The deception continued afterward, and the German 15th Army stayed where it was for weeks, waiting for an attack that was never coming. The last piece of it went out on June 5th itself. Small ships sailed north of Le Havre with their funnels streaming smoke, both to screen themselves and to suggest to German radar that a large fleet was crossing toward a point well north of the real beaches. Now, all the deception in the world wouldn't matter if the Allies couldn't supply the army once it landed. Dieppe had established that the invasion couldn't begin by capturing a port, but an army of 1 million men couldn't be supplied over open beaches indefinitely either. The solution was to build the harbours in England and tow them across. These were the Mulberry Harbours, enormous hollow concrete caissons, basically giant floating boxes, known as phoenixes, were built in British ports, floated to Normandy and sunk in position to form breakwaters. Behind them went floating roadways and pierheads that rose and fell with the tide, so that ships could be unloaded at any state of the water and vehicles could be driven straight onto the beach. 2 of these harbours were assembled, one in the British sector at Arromanches and one in the American sector off Omaha. The one at Arromanches worked for about 10 months, and over its life, somewhere around 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies came through it. Fuel was handled separately by a scheme called Pluto, standing for Pipeline Under the Ocean. The idea was to lay pipelines along the seabed so that gasoline could be pumped directly from England to France without tankers, which would have been vulnerable to air and submarine attack. It was the first undersea oil pipeline ever built. Pipe was wound onto enormous floating drums called conundrums and unrolled across the channel behind a tug. And the pumping stations on the English side were disguised as bungalows, garages, gravel pits, and in one case, an ice cream shop. The design target was 4,000 to 5,000 tons a day, which would have been something close to half the Allied fuel requirement within 2 weeks of the landings. It did not work in time. The line from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, codenamed Bambi, wasn't begun until August 12th, and the first pipe didn't deliver until September 22nd, by which point the fighting had moved far to the east. It was abandoned in early October, having delivered next to nothing. The successful system, Dumbo, ran from Dungeness to Boulogne and didn't start pumping until October 26th, after which it expanded to 17 pipelines and ran until August 1945. Across the whole period from June to October 1944, when it was needed most, Pluto supplied around 1/6 of the fuel used by Allied forces in Normandy. Almost all the rest came in by ship. The second problem was getting off the beach at all. At Dieppe, the tanks had been stopped by the pebbles and the seawall, and the infantry had been left without support. The answer was a set of specialized armored vehicles developed under General Percy Hobart, which the troops called the Funnies, each built to solve one specific obstacle. The DD, or swimming Sherman, was an ordinary Sherman tank fitted with a canvas flotation screen and propellers, so it could be launched offshore, swim in with the first wave, drop its screen on the sand, and fight as a normal tank. Unlike purpose-built amphibious vehicles, it gave up neither armor nor firepower once ashore, and it was used on all 5 beaches. The Crab was a Sherman carrying a rotating drum of heavy chains that beat the ground in front of it and detonated mines at a safe distance. The Churchill AVRE, or Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, had its main gun replaced with a petard spigot mortar that threw a 40-pound demolition charge, known to the crews as the Flying Dustbin, which was intended for concrete emplacements. Other Churchills laid reinforced matting from a drum over soft sand, carried bundles of brushwood to fill ditches, or hauled ramps and bridges for seawalls and gaps. The Churchill Crocodile towed a fuel trailer and shot flame. Alongside these was the American DUKW, an amphibious truck that could swim in from a ship and then drive inland, delivering supplies where they were needed rather than dumping them at the waterline. It was unarmored and was never intended to fight. Between the artificial harbours and the specialised armour, the Allies had answered the 2 problems Dieppe had raised. They could land without a port, and they could get off the beach. Meanwhile, Britain itself was slowly turning into one giant army camp. By February 1944, there were over 800,000 American servicemen in Britain, and the number kept climbing. Before the landings, the total Allied force in England passed 2 million, of whom about 1.5 million were American, which meant there were more American soldiers in the south of England than British ones. They had to be housed, and in some places entire families were moved out of their homes to make room. Relations were generally good, but not without friction. A lot of what was filmed during this period was staged. Training exercises were run for the benefit of newsreel cameras with pyrotechnics and choreographed movement that had little to do with how the operation would actually be conducted. In March, Churchill attended a full-scale American paratroop exercise with Eisenhower present, and British newsreel producers covered it thoroughly, including with cameras mounted inside the aircraft. Churchill is visible in the footage with a cigar. That exercise footage was later used by filmmakers to represent the first American paratroop landings in Normandy, because the actual night drops were never filmed at all. A great deal of what audiences have since understood to be D-Day is a training exercise in England, shot months earlier, with the Prime Minister in the airplane. The men doing the filming were soldiers. The British Army Film and Photographic Unit trained cameramen at its own school and gave them the rank of sergeant, on the reasoning that a sergeant could stay close to the troops without the distance that came with being an officer. The youngest of those covering the invasion was Desmond O'Neill, 20 years old. He later said that his camera was welcome among the men because it distracted them. On May 31st, Grant filmed the distribution of booklets telling the troops about the country they were about to invade, which was the first indication most of them had that the target was Normandy. On June 1st, Clegg filmed the final briefing of his company from above, rather than from ground level, so that nothing in the frame would identify where they were going. Most of the men had never heard of Ouistreham and had no idea where it was. By then, the invasion force had been sealed into camps for 2 weeks to prevent anything leaking. In early June, it moved to the ports, around 20 of them along the south coast, with the British embarking in the east and the Americans in the west. The Canadians provided 21,000 men, the third largest national contingent. Some 20,000 vehicles were backed into the holds of the ships so that they could be driven straight off onto the beaches rather than turned around under fire. The fleet assembled at a rendezvous point southeast of the Isle of Wight, which was nicknamed Piccadilly Circus. The naval part of the operation had its own codename, Neptune. The movement was too large to hide completely, and German gunboats and torpedo boats went after the assembling ships, but the escorts drove them off. Now, one thing nobody could plan around was the weather. The date was set by conditions rather than by choice. The airborne divisions needed moonlight to find their drop zones. The seaborne assault needed to arrive on a rising tide shortly after low water, so that the landing craft would come in short of Rommel's underwater obstacles rather than on top of them, and so that engineers would have exposed beach to work on. Both conditions coincided on only 3 days in June, the 5th, 6th, and 7th. Eisenhower chose June 5th. The weather turned. Eisenhower postponed. Ships that had already sailed had to be recalled into a rising storm, which was itself a risk, because a large fleet putting to sea and then turning back was exactly the kind of movement that might alert German coastal observers. The delay was also dangerous in a different way. If the weather didn't clear within the 3-day window, the operation would slip by 2 weeks or more, and 150,000 men would have to be taken off the ships, held, briefed again, and reloaded, with everything that implied for secrecy and morale. Stagg was right. The night of June 4th to 5th was severe. On the evening of the 4th, his forecast improved. A break was coming, enough for the 5th and 6th. Eisenhower took about half an hour to decide, and the fleet sailed for June 6th. That same night, he wrote a short statement to be released if the landings failed. It said that the attack had been made on the best information available, that the troops had done all that bravery could do, and that if any blame attached to the attempt, it was his alone. He put it in his wallet and it was not needed. So the invasion was on. The bombing came first. Allied aircraft had been attacking transport links across northern France for months, and in the days immediately before the landings, they struck Normandy itself. Around 4,000 Germans and French civilians were killed in Lower Normandy in the final 3 days. This was a subject of real disagreement. Churchill was worried about the hatred the bombing would cause among the people the Allies were about to liberate, and raised it directly with Eisenhower. When the question was put to the French resistance, the answer that came back was that this was a war and that people would inevitably die. The wider figures are worth stating because you'll rarely hear them. Churchill's scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, had estimated before the operation began that between 80,000 and 160,000 French civilians might be killed. The preparatory bombing campaign, which started roughly 3 months before the landings, killed a very large number of people. Estimates run from 15,000 to more than 60,000, depending on where the boundaries of the campaign are drawn. Some of the worst of it fell on the landings themselves rather than before them. Lisieux lost around 700 dead on June 6th and 7th, and Vere around 400 over the same 2 days. The resistance had its own instructions, sent as coded personal messages in BBC broadcasts, based on lines from a Verlaine poem. The first line put the networks on alert, and the second told them to act within 48 hours. The signals section of the German 15th Army heard the second line broadcast on the afternoon of June 5th and correctly understood what it meant, and reported it to Jodl at the German High Command. No order went out to alert the divisions on the coast. The German command was, at that moment, largely absent. Rommel had left his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon on June 4th and driven to Herrlingen in Germany. His wife's 50th birthday fell on June 6th, and he'd bought her a pair of grey suede shoes in Paris. He also intended to ask Hitler for reinforcements while he was there. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army in Normandy, had scheduled a map exercise at Rennes for the morning of the 6th, and the subject of that exercise, of all things, was an Allied landing. His divisional commanders were on the road to Rennes when the real one began. General Feuchtinger of the 21st Panzer Division was also away from his command. Von Rundstedt was at his headquarters, but the armoured reserve was not his to release. Hitler was at the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps. He spent the evening watching newsreels in his private screening room and talking to his entourage, and went to bed at 3 in the morning with the help of medication. German intelligence was already picking up indications that something was happening across the channel, and his staff decided not to wake him until they knew more. The airborne assault went in first. Most of the paratroopers were carried in the Douglas C-47 Skytrain, known in British service as the Dakota, a military version of the DC-3 airliner. Around 23,400 airborne troops went into Normandy from roughly 822 aircraft and gliders. The aircraft had to descend to about 600 feet to drop, which put them within range of every kind of anti-aircraft fire, and they were slow. A paratrooper's parachute opened automatically from a static line, and if it failed or tangled, he had only seconds to use his reserve, which meant a much harder landing. The descent itself took around 35 seconds, during which a man was visible in silhouette against the sky. To spread the defenders' attention, hundreds of dummy paratroopers were dropped as well, called Ruperts by the British and Oscars by the Americans, which couldn't be told apart from real men in the dark. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped onto the Cotentin Peninsula west of Utah Beach with the task of seizing the causeways behind the beach and disrupting any German move toward it. Many aircraft met heavy fire on the approach. First Lieutenant Robert Matthias of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment was hit by anti-aircraft fire before he could jump and became the first American killed on D-Day. A lot of paratroopers came down miles from their drop zones and spent the night fighting in improvised groups with whoever they could find. That was a serious failure of the plan, but it had an unintended benefit. The scattering was so wide that the Germans concluded a far larger force had been dropped than was actually in the air and reacted accordingly. Not all the airborne troops came by parachute. Gliders carried what parachutes could not, including light guns and vehicles, and landed by what amounted to a controlled crash. The British airspeed Horsa carried up to 30 men and was built largely of wood, both to save strategic metals and because it was unlikely to survive its first operation. The Hamilcar was larger and carried light tanks and 17-pounder guns, and had been designed to a specification Churchill himself set out in 1941. The most numerous was the American Waco CG-4, called the Hadrian in British service, which carried 13 men, or a jeep or a single 75mm howitzer. It was smaller than the Horsa, which meant it could use fields the larger gliders couldn't, and its entire nose and cockpit were hinged so they could swing upward to unload. It also carried a cable that would lift the cockpit clear if the cargo broke loose on landing and slid forward, which would otherwise have crushed the pilots. The British 6th Airborne Division used gliders to take the bridges over the River Orne and the Caen Canal in the first minutes of June 6th, landing beside them in the dark and holding them until relief arrived from the beaches. Late on the afternoon of June 5th, before any of this began, Eisenhower drove to Greenham Common and walked among the men of the 101st Airborne as they prepared to board. He stayed until the last aircraft had taken off. Then came the fleet. Around 7,000 vessels crossed the channel. Nearly 160,000 troops went into Normandy on June 6th, counted across the whole operation, seaborne and airborne together, supported by roughly 11,000 aircraft, all of them painted with broad white and black stripes so that Allied gunners wouldn't fire on them. The bombardment began before dawn, with aircraft over the coastal positions from a little after 3 in the morning and naval gunfire taking over at first light. Omaha was 5 miles of beach backed by bluffs, and it was the most heavily defended of the 5. Everything that could go wrong at the start of the landing did. Clouds covered the target, and the heavy bombers, worried about hitting the fleet, released late, so most of their bombs fell inland and the beach defenses were untouched. The naval bombardment had less time than it needed because the landing hour was fixed by the tide. Landing craft were released too far out on a rough sea, and many were swept off course by the current, so that units came ashore in the wrong places and mixed together. Men who went into deep water were dragged under by the weight of their equipment. The assault fell to the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. Going in at 6:30, The 1st Division was experienced. The 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th, which landed alongside it, had never been in action. What they met was an almost intact defensive system, manned by the German 352nd Division. The formation Allied intelligence had failed to place, together with elements of the 716th Division and an Ost battalion of Eastern European conscripts. The first waves were pinned at the waterline. One signal sent from the beach reported the men nailed to the spot by enemy artillery. American commanders offshore considered abandoning the landing at Omaha altogether and diverting the follow-up waves elsewhere, which would have meant leaving the men already ashore to their fate and opening a gap in the middle of the invasion front. What broke it was partly small groups of men working their way up the bluffs on their own initiative, and partly a German mistake. The defense was going so well that General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd, accepted reports from his forward positions that the Americans were withdrawing. Landing craft were in fact returning to the ships to collect more men. On that basis, Kreis committed his divisional reserve eastward against the British at Gold, the next beach over. By the end of the day, around 34,000 Americans were ashore. Omaha cost about 2,400 casualties, of whom roughly 770 were killed, the heaviest toll of any beach. The 352nd lost about 1,200 men, a tenth of its strength, and had nothing behind it. Almost nothing of the German side of that morning survives in the form of first-hand testimony, but one position is an exception. Omaha was held by 15 strongpoints, numbered from WN60 in the east to WN74 in the west, the letters standing for Widerstands Nest, or Resistance Nest. The strongest of them was WN62, which sat on high ground overlooking the Colleville Draw, one of the few routes off the beach, and which could fire along the sand rather than out at it. It covered about 300 yards square and was manned by around 40 men, most of them from the static 716th Division, with a small group attached from the 352nd, whose job was to direct the fire of artillery batteries about 3 miles inland. Off the western end of Omaha stood Pointe du Hoc, a 100-foot cliff with a battery of 6 155mm guns believed to be sighted on top of it, positioned to fire on both American beaches. The task of taking it went to 225 men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder. They were carried in landing craft and DUKWs, came in about 3 miles off course and 40 minutes late, and lost craft on the way in. The DUKWs carried extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, which were never much use because the DUKWs couldn't get across the pebbles. The Rangers climbed on rope ladders and rocket-fired grappling hooks instead under fire and took only around 15 casualties getting to the top. When they got there, the guns were gone. The Germans had moved them inland, and the Rangers found them unattended in an orchard about 500 yards away and destroyed them. The cost came afterward. Cut off on the cliff top, they held against repeated counterattacks for 2 days, and when relief reached them on the morning of June 8th, fewer than 90 of the original 225 were still able to fight. Now to the other American beach. Utah was the westernmost beach, and it had been added to the plan late, specifically to give the Allies a starting point for the drive on Cherbourg 35 miles to the north. It was assaulted by the American 4th Infantry Division of 7th Corps. The landing went wrong immediately, and it saved lives. A strong current pushed the leading craft more than a mile south of the intended sector. The men came ashore in the wrong place, and the wrong place turned out to be a gap between German strongpoints where the defenses were far weaker than those they'd been briefed to attack. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the eldest son of the former president, had gone in with the first wave despite being 56 years old and the oldest Allied soldier at the front. He established where they actually were, decided against trying to shift the landing back to its planned position, and began the attack from where the men stood. He then spent the day moving between units under fire, directing traffic off the beach and reorganizing formations as they arrived. The main German position on the beach was a single 88mm gun, which was destroyed early, and its crew surrendered. All 3 of the main exits inland were secured within 3 hours. By the end of the day, 20,000 troops and 1,700 vehicles had crossed Utah for fewer than 300 casualties on the beach itself, which makes it by far the cheapest of the 5 landings. The airborne divisions who had dropped behind it took around 2,500. Roosevelt was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. He died of a heart attack on July 12th, a little over a month later, and the recommendation was upgraded to the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously. Next come the British and Canadian beaches. Gold was a 10-mile stretch in the center of the invasion front, assaulted by the British 50th Northumbrian Division with 47 Royal Marine Commando. Its main objective was the small harbour town of Arromanches, which had been selected as the site for one of the 2 Mulberry harbours. The defence was provided by elements of the German 716th Division, which included a substantial number of Poles and Soviet prisoners who had been pressed into German service, along with a battery of 4 155mm guns sighted half a mile inland. The British went in an hour after the Americans because the tide reached them later. An unexpected northwest wind held the water higher than forecast, so that many of the German underwater obstacles stayed submerged and couldn't be seen or avoided. Around 20 landing craft were lost on them. The weather also meant the swimming Shermans had to be brought much closer in before being launched. Once ashore, the specialized armor did what it had been built for. The strong point at Le Hamel held out and kept firing on the beach until the middle of the afternoon, when a VRS destroyed the fortification protecting it. By the end of the day, 25,000 men were ashore for about 400 casualties, and the beachhead was secure enough for work on the Mulberry to begin. Juno lay between Gold and Sword and was assaulted by the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division with the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade and British 48 Commando. A reef offshore forced the landing to be delayed until 7:45, when the tide would be high enough to carry the craft over it. It did carry them over the reef and straight onto the mined obstacles, and roughly a third of the landing craft struck mines on the way in. Nearly half the Canadian casualties of the day were suffered in the first hour. The defenders were the German 716th Division, with an attached Ost battalion of Poles and Soviet conscripts. The Canadians pushed through and drove them back, and by the end of the day, 21,400 men had landed, and Canadian units had advanced farther inland than any other force on June 6th. They did not reach Carpiquet airfield, which had been set as the day's objective. Carpiquet held out until July. Casualties at Juno were between 946 and just over 1,000, with 340 to 370 killed. Juno produced the only footage of a first assault wave shot anywhere on D-Day, and no cameraman took it. It came from an automatic camera fixed to a landing craft, running without an operator. The cameramen who were present were given other instructions. The first French house liberated in Normandy was taken at a cost of around 100 men, and Allied cameramen were asked not to film it. What they filmed instead were the first German prisoners. And that leaves the easternmost beach, Sword, which had been a seaside resort before the war. The Germans had demolished many of the summer houses along the front to clear fields of fire and had turned others into strongpoints, with an anti-tank ditch dug behind the sea wall. Guns at Merville and Le Havre covering the approaches were given particular attention by bombers and by airborne troops beforehand. The landings began at 7:25, made by the British 3rd Division with the 27th Armoured Brigade and British and French commandos. The tasks were to neutralise the defences at Ouistreham, push inland to relieve the airborne troops holding the Orne and Canal bridges, link westward with the Canadians from Juno, and take Caen the same day. The initial landing was not the hardest part. The difficulty came inland. The beach narrowed as the tide rose and traffic backed up in the cramped streets of the coastal towns while German resistance continued at Ouistreham. Then the 21st Panzer Division counterattacked, the only German armoured formation to fight in strength, on June 6th and drove between the British and the Canadians at Juno, blocking the link between the two beachheads. Its own attack was broken up partly by Allied air power and partly by chance. In the evening, a wave of gliders came down near the German positions, having missed their landing zones entirely, and the panzer crews, believing they were about to be surrounded, pulled back. At sea, 3 E-boats of the German 5th Torpedo Boat Flotilla came out of Le Havre, found the invasion fleet partly obscured by smoke, and fired 18 torpedoes into it. One hit. It sank the Norwegian destroyer Svena, and it was the only significant German naval success of the entire day. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s strafed the beach, and a few dive bombers attempted daylight attacks and were destroyed almost immediately. During the day, 28,500 men crossed Sword for around 630 casualties. Caen was not taken. The link-up with the Canadians was made the following day. So what took the Germans so long? The German reaction on June 6th was slow, and the reasons were structural rather than accidental. The system depended on decisions taken at the top, and the top was asleep. Von Rundstedt asked early in the morning for the release of 2 armoured divisions held in reserve near Paris. He had to ask because Panzer Group West answered to the German High Command, and the release required Hitler's personal authorization. The High Command was reluctant. If Normandy was the feint that everyone had spent months being told to expect, then committing the reserve there was exactly the mistake the Allies wanted them to make. Albert Speer arrived at the Berghof around 10 in the morning, and Hitler was still in bed. He was awakened around noon. His reaction was not what his staff expected. According to the historian Stephen Ambrose, Hitler said that the news could not be better. Goebbels recorded that he seemed relieved as though a burden had lifted. The reasoning behind it was that the Allied armies had been massing in England where they couldn't be attacked, and now they were within reach of German guns. He agreed to release the reserve at his midday conference. By then it was too late for the divisions to be of use on the first day. Orders reached the 12th SS Panzer Division at around 3 in the afternoon and Panzer Lehr shortly afterward, and both were told that Allied air superiority meant they would have to wait for darkness before moving. Panzer Lehr didn't reach the front until June 8th, and the 21st Panzer at Caen, the one division that did fight in strength that day, was under Rommel's direct command rather than the Central Reserve. Hitler remained convinced that the main attack was still to come at Calais, and the German 15th Army stayed where it was. That belief, sustained by Fortitude, was worth more to the Allies on June 6th than anything else in the plan. The German Navy and Air Force achieved almost nothing. Beyond the single torpedo that sank the Svenna, there was no effective interference at sea during the day. U-boats put out to sea after dark and reached the invasion area in daylight on June 7th, where 2 were sunk and 4 badly damaged almost immediately because Allied aircraft were now using radar to find them on the surface. The only boats fitted with snorkels, which would have let them run submerged, were based in the Bay of Biscay and northern Norway, and it took them until the middle of June to work through the Allied anti-submarine screen, by which time the beachhead was established. On land, German reinforcements coming from Brittany and from south of the Loire were delayed by a combination of air attack and resistance action against bridges, roads and rail lines. Isolated German positions inside the beachhead held out for a long time. One bunker between Sword and Juno, housing a radar installation, fought on for 12 days after the landings, well behind the Allied front. By nightfall on June 6th, more than 100,000 Allied troops were established ashore in the 5 beachheads, out of the nearly 160,000 committed to the operation across the day. 4 of the 5 beachheads were secure. Omaha was still precarious, with the Americans having pushed barely a mile inland. Allied losses for the day came to just over 10,300 killed, wounded and missing, of whom around 4,400 are now confirmed dead. German losses were substantially lower. None of the day's larger objectives had been met. The 5 beachheads were not joined. Caen was supposed to fall on the first day, but it was in German hands and would remain so. Carpiquet had not been reached. What had been achieved was a foothold, and the next question was whether it could be widened before the Germans concentrated enough force to remove it. And widening it turned out to be a lot harder than anyone had hoped. Montgomery arrived in Normandy 2 days after the landings, and the situation he found wasn't the one his plan had assumed. Caen had been the objective for June 6th. It was a road and rail hub through which German reinforcements would have to pass, and beyond it lay open country where armor could deploy and airfields could be built. Instead, the British had stopped short, and the Germans had used the time. 2 armoured divisions, including the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend, counterattacked between June 7th and 9th and barred the road to Caen against the British and Canadians. They then established their defensive positions outside the city rather than in it, which had a consequence that shaped the next 6 weeks. Bombing Caen itself did very little damage to the troops holding the approaches, because the troops were not in Caen. What it did was destroy the city and kill the people living in it, which German propaganda then used to show its own soldiers suffering alongside French civilians. The airborne divisions had paid heavily for the confusion of the night drops. The American airborne lost more than half their equipment, and 1 man in 5, and many of those who came down in isolated groups were eventually surrounded and captured. On June 9th, the Americans took Isigny, which mattered because German resistance there had been keeping the Omaha and Utah beachheads apart. With it gone, the Allied front became continuous for the first time, running about 60 miles from Ouistreham to the Cotentin. On June 19th, the weather broke. A storm hit the Normandy coast that was the worst in 40 years, and it lasted 4 days. Ships were thrown about inside the anchorages. Caissons broke loose and let the sea into the harbours, and floating roadways were torn away. When it cleared on June 23rd, hundreds of wrecked ships and craft were aground along the beaches. British engineers repaired the Mulberry at Arromanches, and it worked for months. The American harbour off Omaha was written off. The supply plan was now about 10 days behind. That made Cherbourg urgent. The American attack on the city began on June 22nd. Von Schlieben, commanding the garrison, asked Hitler for permission to surrender and was refused. Fort de Roule, which dominated the city, fell on June 26th, and von Schlieben was found the same day in an underground shelter at Saint-Sauveur, having sent a final message to Berlin saying that his documents were burned and his codes destroyed. He surrendered with Admiral Walter Hennecker and about 800 men. Around 10,000 prisoners were taken in the city that evening, and roughly 20,000 in total, from a garrison of about 25,000. The naval arsenal held out until the following morning, so that von Schlieben surrendered before his own men did. After Cherbourg, Hitler removed von Rundstedt, who had suggested that the position in the west was hopeless and that terms should be sought, and replaced him with Field Marshal von Kluge, who arrived from the Eastern Front knowing little about Normandy. The Americans in the meantime were stuck in the bocage. This was farmland divided into small fields by hedgerows grown on earth banks, some of them centuries old, with sunken lanes between them. It was ideal defensive country. A few men with a machine gun could hold up a battalion, and when they lost a field, they could fall back to the next one and start again. Attacking troops couldn't see where they were going. Tanks couldn't push through the banks and were forced onto the roads, where they were easy targets, or over the tops of the banks, which exposed their thin belly armor to anti-tank fire. American infantry, most of whom had never been in action, took thousands of casualties learning the ground. The eventual answer was mechanical. Tanks were fitted with steel-cutting blades at the front that could tear through a hedgerow rather than climb it. The Caen front finally moved in July, and only after Montgomery applied overwhelming force. The Royal Air Force dropped over 2,500 tons of bombs on the city. After 2 days of fighting, British troops entered the eastern half of what was left of it. Montgomery came into Caen on July 13th. It had taken him more than a month to capture part of a city he'd expected to hold on the first day, and the western half remained German until the city was fully cleared on July 21st. The cost to Caen was severe. Around 3,000 civilians were killed there between June 6th and July 19th, and 35,000 people were left homeless. The city was about 3/4 destroyed. Whether the bombing was necessary, given that the German defensive positions were outside the city rather than in it, has been argued about ever since, and some historians have described it as close to a war crime. British propaganda filmed troops and inhabitants drinking a toast together in the ruins. Much of the city was still in German hands at the time. Churchill came over a few days later to see the Caen sector for himself, with Montgomery acting as guide. 10 days after the city fell, the British had still not broken through the German line beyond it. For Eisenhower, who had expected the breakthrough to come there, this was a failure in proportion to the resources committed. Rommel's part in the campaign ended on July 17th, when British fighters strafed his staff car near Vimoutiers. His driver was mortally wounded, and Rommel was severely injured. What followed belongs to a later part of the year, but it finishes his story and is worth taking out of sequence here. 3 days after he was wounded came the attempt on Hitler's life at his eastern headquarters. Rommel was implicated in the conspiracy, and on October 14th he was given the choice between the People's Court and poison. He took poison and was buried with a state funeral and an official account that he had died of his wounds. Now back to the front. Eisenhower had been placing increasing trust in Omar Bradley, who had organized the American landings at Omaha and Utah and then taken Cherbourg, and who was calm and methodical in a way Eisenhower valued. Bradley believed the way out of the deadlock wasn't through Caen, but through the American sector, and he planned an operation to force it. The plan for Operation Cobra was to obliterate a narrow stretch of the German front line with heavy bombers and then push armor through the hole before the defenders could recover. It was scheduled for July 24th and it went wrong twice. On the 24th, the weather closed in and the aircraft were recalled, but some had already released. Their bombs fell behind American lines and killed or wounded about 150 men. The operation was reset for the following day. On July 25th, around 1,500 heavy bombers dropped some 3,300 tons on a stretch of road between Saint-Lô and Perrier. The plan had been for the bombers to approach parallel to the American front line to reduce the risk, but most came in over the top of it instead, and bombs again fell short. This time, 111 Americans were killed and nearly 500 wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who had come forward to observe and who was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. The bombardment did what it was meant to do to the Germans. Panzer lost roughly half its combat strength. But when the American infantry moved forward, they found, to their surprise, that substantial numbers of German troops had survived and were still fighting, and for a day, it looked as though the attack would fail like the ones before it. Then the German defense gave way. American tanks broke through the following morning into open country where there was very little left to stop them. Coutances fell, then Avranches, and by the end of July, American armor had reached the last towns in Normandy before Brittany. On August 1st, Patton took command of the newly activated Third Army and drove through the gap, moving fast and meeting little resistance. In early August, the 2nd French Armored Division landed at Utah under General Leclerc and was attached to the Third Army, which meant that after 4 years, French troops were fighting on French soil as part of the main advance. Under pressure from Eisenhower, Montgomery had agreed to leave the organization of the final battle to the Americans. On August 7th, the Germans attacked at Mortain in an operation Hitler planned personally, intending to reach the sea at Avranches and cut Patton's army off from its supply. It was broken quickly, partly by rocket-firing typhoons and partly because it drove into a position that was about to be surrounded anyway. It was the last German offensive in the West. The counterattack made things worse for the Germans because it pushed their strength farther into a pocket that was closing behind them. Patton's division swung north toward Argentan, while the British and Canadians pushed south from Caen, and the German 7th Army was caught between them around Falaise. The pocket was closed on August 21st. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 German troops were trapped, of whom 10,000 to 15,000 were killed and 40,000 to 50,000 taken prisoner. Between 20,000 and 50,000 got out before it shut. Eisenhower walked the field afterward and described it as the worst killing ground of the war, saying it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards over nothing but dead flesh, and that only Dante could have described it properly. Von Kluge was relieved of command on August 17th, having written that the Mortain attack had never had a chance of success and that the position in Normandy was finished. He took cyanide on August 19th while traveling back to Germany. While this was happening, a second Allied invasion of France landed on the Mediterranean coast on August 15th. Operation Dragoon had been argued over for months. The British thought it a diversion of resources from Italy and elsewhere, and Churchill made a final attempt to stop it in a heated meeting with Eisenhower on August 9th. The Americans regarded it as essential to clearing the Germans out of France and to opening the southern ports. It landed against very light opposition, with French troops alongside the Americans, and advanced quickly up the Rhone Valley. Lyon was liberated on September 3rd, and the force made contact with Patton's troops near Dijon. Back up north, Paris was coming to a boil. By mid-August, the German position in France had collapsed. On August 19th, the resistance in Paris rose against the occupation, and the German army decided to abandon the capital rather than fight for it, pulling its convoys out eastward past the barricades. Dozens of the men and women who had risen were killed fighting the retreating columns. De Gaulle went to Eisenhower's headquarters the next day. Eisenhower's preference was to bypass Paris, surround it, and let it fall without a battle. Fighting inside a city of that size would be costly and slow, and taking it meant taking responsibility for feeding several million people at a moment when the supply system was already stretched. De Gaulle argued for going in, both to prevent a prolonged fight and to prevent the communist elements of the resistance from establishing themselves as the authority in the capital before he arrived. Eisenhower agreed, and Bradley detached Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division so that a French formation would enter Paris first and take the German surrender. The city was liberated on August 25th, and Leclerc's troops were met with the kind of reception that has defined the memory of it since. There was a parade down the Champs-Élysées. German forces withdrew across the Seine on August 30th, which formally closed Operation Overlord. Germany surrendered 11 months and 1 day after the landings. What survives of the visual record needs to be understood for what it is, because a great deal of what is now taken as documentary footage of D-Day is not. The airborne drops on the night of June 5th to 6th were never filmed. The footage generally used to represent them comes from a training exercise held in England in March, at which Churchill was present with a cigar, filmed by newsreel crews with cameras mounted in the aircraft. Much of the other training material from Britain was similarly staged for the cameras, rather than recorded as it happened.